Dr. Kulakevich is an associate professor of instruction in research methods and quantitative analysis at USF's School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies and a research fellow and affiliated faculty at the USF Institute for Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies. She received her MA in International Relations from New York University and her PhD in Political Science from Rutgers University. Her research focuses on democratization, international security, migration, and ethnic politics. David Kramer serves as executive director of the George W. Bush Institute. Prior to joining the Bush Institute, he taught at Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International Public Affairs, where he was also senior fellow in the Václav Havel Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy and director for European and Eurasian Affairs. So they'll go over a brief summary of their deep dives today, and I'll turn it over to Tad to go ahead and make that.
Sure. Welcome everyone to our last event. So hang on just a few more minutes. So we had two excellent workshops today that did a deep dive on each respective topic. So we wanted to bring the leaders of those workshops in case you could not attend both of them unless you're someone special or some way. But we wanted to give a deep dive. What were the lessons learned from those topics? What was discussed and what can we take away? So I'd like to hand it first over to David and see one, just a quick summary. What was the workshop framework? How did you go about it? And then what were two the major takeaways for lessons learned for future conflicts?
Sure, Ted, thanks so much. And again, my apologies for not being there in person, but I appreciate very much the opportunity to be with you remotely. The deep dive we did focused on Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China, although China actually wasn't in the initial title of the session. And some call this CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, axis of upheaval and other things. The bottom line, I think, from the session was that this is both a marriage of convenience where the regimes in these four countries are working together, but it's also grounded in efforts to try to undermine the United States and our democratic allies in various parts of the world. And working together, they are more effective than if they remain on their own. In fact, when you look at some of them operating on their own, we have seen them to be exposed as much weaker countries and regimes than might otherwise have been anticipated. We see this with Iran put back on its heels as a result of what Israel has been able to accomplish in dealing with Hezbollah and Hamas, as well as strikes on Iran itself. We see this in Russia, where Russia encountered tremendous resistance as a result of the amazing heroism and fighting capability of the Ukrainians, where the Ukrainians have inflicted more than 800,000 casualties on the Russian side and done lots of damage to Russia's military capabilities. We also have seen that had it not been for the Iranian and North Korean assistance to Russia in the early stages of the full-scale invasion, Russia's military situation would be even in more dire straits than it currently is. But it is thanks to Iranian Shahed drones in the early stages and more recently North Korean troops that have actually been sent that we see these countries work together. China's been a little more sophisticated in its support for the Russian war effort, not providing overt military assistance, but providing dual-use technology and also providing critical economic assistance, purchases of energy, and so on. But I think all of this underscores the importance that the democratic world, led by the United States, but working closely with our allies in Europe and elsewhere, has a critical responsibility to stay united. One of the biggest pluses and advantages for the Axis, for the bad guys, if you will, is if we show a lack of unity. And this also, I think, reinforces the importance of sticking with NATO, recognizing that NATO has been the most successful military alliance in history, arguably, and recognizing that it is membership in NATO that has kept the countries along Russia's borders that are NATO member states safer than they otherwise would be. So let me sort of pause there and happy to take any questions, but I think that's sort of the bottom line that I would take from the session that we had earlier today. Thank you.
The only immediate follow-up question, David, would be once the war ends, whether if it's in a peace negotiation in the coming weeks or later on, does this axis of upheaval hold together? Is there still a common cause after the conflict is over, or does it start to come apart?
I think it depends on how the war ends. If the war ends in a way that leaves Russia in a position where it can continue to threaten Ukraine, where it can continue to pose a threat to others in its neighborhood, then I think that holds the possibility for this alliance to hold together. Part of it will also depend on how Israel deals with Iran and Iran's efforts to develop nuclear weapons capability. But I think if the West, the United States, as well as our European allies, stick together with Ukraine, then we have a possibility to deal a blow not only to Putin and his forces, but would also give, for example, Chinese leader Xi much more to think about before he might launch any moves against Taiwan. And I think that's where the global implications of supporting Ukraine need to be underscored. This is not just about Ukraine. It's not just about Europe, as important as those are. This has global repercussions, and it's why Taiwanese, for example, are among Ukraine's biggest supporters. They recognize that the ability of the West to sustain its support for Ukraine matters not just for Ukraine, but it matters for Taiwan and the rest of Asia as well. So that I think this is the fight right now that is unfolding, and being able to continue to support Ukraine will remain very, very important.
Thank you. Let's take a little different approach going to the other workshop. Tatsiana, if you could give us a quick summary and talk about civilians in war and what happened there and the two big takeaways from it.
Well, thank you for having me. And I see some participants from my workshop here in the audience. Thank you for coming. And well, our workshop focused on civilians in war. And I first started talking about my own experiences. In the fall, I visited Kiev, and I was one of those civilians in war. And well, we analyze the setting David mentioned already also, but focused on the angle that is being a little bit ignored while big politicians are playing their game. And these are civilians who are watching the TV and are feeling on the ground and worrying how these politicians are deciding their lives. These are people who are fighting on the ground and who are sitting in the cities and experiencing the air raids. So I told some personal stories. I told people that about the North Star, and that's a Starlink. And if people maybe are not aware, the Starlink is really provides hope for Ukraine. Why? Because when they do not have electricity, they actually are online, even if the power is off. So stories on the ground. We also had a practice kind of workshop, imagining ourselves that what if we are faced with choices the civilians are in the war are facing. We looked at the different complex types of civilians, including children, male adults who cannot leave Ukraine, and actually countries aspects as well. There are civilians not just in Ukraine, but also in Russia who are experiencing the war and are thinking whether I stay in Russia or I leave to Georgia or any other country to escape the drafting. And immigrants who are in Poland and in Europe these days. We talked about humanitarian crisis. And the main takeaway from the workshop is that while we watch TV, and as Trump mentioned during the Oval fiasco the other day with Zelensky, that would make the great television, and the main winner was Putin, who was actually watching the TV. The war is ongoing and people are dying on the ground, and we should still remember about them, that their feelings should not be ignored while the politicians are deciding people's fates. So that was the main takeaway in our And I want to say that I actually learned a few things from my participants. Like I see Doug. We talked about the app, for example, which announces the air raids in Ukraine. Apparently, it was developed during COVID, and they adopted that for the war. And that's technology, kind of connecting to the previous panel.
Sure. So I heard you mention about people leaving the conflict zone, obviously making that decision, whether the Russians leaving to avoid the draft or the Ukrainians obviously to avoid maybe bombings or also, mobilizations. What would that look like in other conflicts? Let's say in Taiwan, perhaps, where you really can't go if the conflict starts very quickly. You'd have to get on a boat, or you're just not contained. So this being more of a landlocked engagement, can you see some differences in a future conflict, maybe over Taiwan or elsewhere?
Well, we are looking. While we were imagining ourselves, people, participants. The main observation was that people want to escape and leave, but at the same time, if you think closer, you have some, examples in Ukraine when you couldn't leave, like Mariupol, where people were found themselves in the bomb shelters in the factories where they rationed food and actually end up dying. Many of them became the prisoners of war. Some survived and were exchanged later. Yes, right now. And we talked about that as well, that China is fishing. Literally, I showed the cartoon, like they are sitting with a rod and fishing Taiwan, looking if they could catch it, if Ukraine would be abandoned. Yes, so we will look at it. If Ukraine is surviving, then Taiwan has hope and they will have more time to decide where to live or not, and that's unfolding. So yes, but the main first decision for everybody is to survive somehow.
Let's go back to David. David, in the axis of upheaval, obviously we have Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran. If the war continues to progress, are there any other countries that might end up joining the axis, or any other countries that are showing inclinations, maybe not completely anti-West, but that might be supporting this axis of upheaval, particularly if the war continues?
Well, there's one country that isn't mentioned in that connection, but it already has been involved extensively, and that's Belarus. Under Alexander Lukashenko, who's been in power since 1994, Lukashenko, after stealing the August 2020 election, became even more dependent on Putin for staying in power, and has essentially allowed Putin and Russia to annex Belarus, albeit not in a formal way. But Lukashenko, most importantly, allowed Belarusian territory to be used for the initial stages of the full-scale invasion against Ukraine. And so Lukashenko really is already involved, I would argue already complicit in enabling Russian war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide against the Ukrainian people. It is interesting that in the past few weeks, senior U.S. official visited Minsk to try to secure the release of several individuals. 3 people were released, but we need to remember that over 1,200 political prisoners still exist in Belarus. So Belarus certainly would fall into that category. We're seeing odd dynamics in the country of Georgia, which has a pro-Russian leadership under the oligarch Benzina Ivanishvili, who has also been involved in some sanctions evasion. And there are other countries that are involved in sanctions evasion. So I don't know that we'll see outright formal joining of this alliance, but we will see some countries, if Russia were to prevail in Ukraine, countries helping with the sanctions evasion. From Kazakhstan, and our deep dive session, a person brought up the point of India and others. We saw the gathering of the BRICS in Kazan last year. The Secretary General, much to my dismay, went to Kazan and shook hands with Putin, even though he didn't go to a gathering in Geneva that the Ukrainians organized a month or 2 before. So there is this tendency to try to help out without being too overt about it, because of the possibility of being hit by secondary sanctions from the United States and our allies. But it is important to understand that some of these countries are waiting to see how this war plays out and might be tempted to be more supportive if it turns into Russia's favor.
Tatsiana, for the civilians in Ukraine, if the war continues, what could that mean? I mean, obviously it's a very tough situation, but if we have this axis of upheaval continually in the conflict, what do you see playing out there on the ground?
Yes, well, thank you, David, for mentioning Belarus. I'm originally from Belarus, and we also discussed that Lukashenko deserves the International Criminal Court warrant as well, kind of together with Putin. In terms of civilians, while I was in Ukraine, I attended a few forums, international economic forums. They have a reforms forum, and the big deal that they are doing these days is this kind of initiative that's called Made in Ukraine. So they are encouraging people who are in Ukraine or who are outside Ukraine to use Ukrainian goods these days, and they are engaging civilians to participate. They are trying to draft, not military draft, but kind of gather, encourage professionals to come to Ukraine, investors and Ukrainians who are left the country. So they are already trying to target those who left. And you can see across the city saying, we will build future Kiev, come back. So they are encouraging that. But the reality is this: Belarusians are fleeing Belarusian regime, and Ukrainians are, and as well, Ukrainians and Belarusians flooded Poland, Lithuania, closer border countries. And if these civilians are located very close to the border, it is a better chance that they will come home. But as the time goes, they relocate farther and farther. A lot of Ukrainians are using U4U programs. They come to the United States. They are trying to legalize here. And as the time passes, the less likely people will be returning. Some will return, and some are returning. A lot of students actually, make decisions to go and study in Ukraine instead of Europe. That's a fact. But in reality, the longer the war lasts, the longer the conflict is. People abroad, immigrants, they are getting used to that new life. They go to find the jobs. Children go to universities, and that's going to be their choice to stay in those countries, legalize, and be there. So it's both, but again, depends how long.
So based off the two respective workshops, what would be one policy, if you were the policymaker, would you implement to address or at least try to solve the challenges that you faced? We'll go over to you, David.
I would say to stick with NATO, to recognize that NATO is important, and to not close doors to NATO. I know there has been talk that from some administration officials that Ukraine will not join. I think it is better to keep all of our cards to ourselves and not put them on the table before any talks and negotiations might begin, but also to recognize that NATO enables member states to sleep better at night than if they were not members. If you look at the countries that Russia has attacked, it's Georgia and Ukraine. Georgia 2008, Ukraine, by the way, not just in 2022, but starting in 2014. And in large part, that's because they are in a gray zone. They're not members of NATO, though they have sought NATO membership. And so I think recognizing the vital role that NATO plays, and obviously an extension of that our allies play. We are much better off working together with our allies, whether in Europe or anywhere else in the world, than if we were trying to do things on our own. So that would be my recommendation, which is to make sure that we work together. This access is working together. And the least we can and should do in response is to make sure we work effectively together as well.
So we discussed in the first panel a realist approach that the expansion of NATO actually might have pushed the Russians to be more aggressive. What's your thoughts on that, David?
have to respectfully but strongly disagree with that. If we go back to the first invasion of Ukraine, it was in November of 2013 when the pro-Russian Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, was about to sign agreements with the European Union, not with NATO. 3 years before, in 2010, Yanukovych signed legislation that made Ukraine a non-aligned state. Ukraine was not seeking NATO membership after Yanukovych became president. So in 2013, late 2013, the problem Putin had was not about NATO. It was because Ukraine was about to sign agreements with the European Union. Yanukovych caved under that pressure, and Putin still invaded, starting with the illegal annexation of Crimea in February 2014. So if we go back to the origins of the war by Russia, and it's clear Russia is the guilty aggressor party, it had nothing to do with NATO. In 2022, fast forward, Zelensky had been seeking closer ties with NATO after he won the 2019 presidential election. He kept knocking on the door, but NATO wasn't answering. Both the United States and Germany in particular made it clear that they were not supportive of deepening ties between NATO and Ukraine, although in the last NATO communique, it said that Ukraine's move toward membership was irreversible. Not quite sure what that means in practical terms. But Putin has had a tendency to blame NATO enlargement when it's convenient. But we have to remember that the origins of the war had nothing to do with NATO. And frankly, Zelensky wasn't making progress with NATO in 21, 22. And so really NATO wasn't the issue then. The bottom line is Putin viewed the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He is interested in expanding Russia's influence and control over his neighboring states and doesn't recognize Ukraine as an independent state. He told my boss that, President George Bush, in April 2008. He has repeated that view numerous times. In July 21, he issued a treatise that he described Ukrainians and Russians as being one people. He doesn't view Ukraine as an independent state, and he certainly doesn't want a Ukraine that is moving toward a successful democracy, more integrated with the West, to be on Russia's borders. Remember that in 2013 and 2014, when Ukrainians protested the decision not to sign agreements with the EU, that followed only 2 years after major protests in Moscow over the Duma elections and then Putin's return to power as president. And so I think we have to dispel the notion that it was NATO enlargement that was responsible. It also tends to absolve Putin of what I would consider to be the full responsibility that he bears for what has happened in Ukraine.
Thank you. Tatsiana, you're a policymaker. You can address the challenges that you talked about in your workshop. How would you do so?
I would say my advice is for Europe. So to be more proactive than reactive. And that's because they are facing not just the war close to their borders, but also humanitarian crisis. So that kind of relates to civilians in war. And that's also, we start observing that already today. After yesterday, everybody saw the news that United States military aid was paused to Ukraine, and Europe is reacting today that they are gonna invest more into Ukrainian to support Ukraine, and that comes after the news that they spent more money on Russia's gas than the aid to Ukraine. That's also the news. So my advice to European leaders is guys, try to figure out what's going on within Europe to proactively to be proactive there, because that's what the United States administration wants these days, and that's the reality, without being hopeful. And I would say your Ukrainian government already is doing, they know that they need to encourage people who left to come back and rebuild Ukraine. They are making steps of that already. I would say they will be doing that anyway. And I would say that they should be doing that even more. Target professionals, target biochemists and technology, and basically use all technological advancements that United States is offering them. So that's my advice.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And we'd like to thank our workshop leaders and for them to come back and give us a summary and kind of the big takeaways. So thank you, David, Tatsiana.
Thank you. Thank you,
you.
guys.
Thank you. Appreciate it.